All right. Hello, everyone. Looks like we got a few more people filing in, but we'll go ahead and get started. Be respectful of everyone's time here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's webinar here, Ensuring Equitable Treatment and Rebuilding Public Trust in the Appraisal Process. I'm glad to have everyone on the line because this is a really sensitive topic. And this is a subject that has gotten, even before the event has happened, has gotten some really passionate feedback from members of the appraiser community, which we appreciate. The idea here is that we all need to get on the same page. We need to talk and we need to listen. And as an AMC, we find ourselves with the ability to gather information and perspective from a wide array of sources, and most importantly being our appraiser partners. So the fact that you guys take time out of your busy day to be here and to have this discussion is greatly appreciated. Understanding that we all have some pretty strong feelings and passionate feelings about it. We want this to be interactive. We want this to be a dialogue. I would love for you guys to put your questions, comments, thoughts into the chat. If you see the little chat bubble at the top left of your screen. My only request is that we keep it respectful and professional, only because, again, I know that it's something that brings out passion in people, and we want to hear it. We just want to make sure that we do it in the right way. So with that caveat, please do share your thoughts, share your opinions. We want you to be honest, right? You don't have to agree with everything you hear, and that's okay. It's important that we get your perspective too. So let me jump right in and introduce here our featured speakers today. First off, I'm Steve Sussman. I serve as our Chief Business Development Officer here at NAN. I have the privilege of moderating the discussion today with two very qualified ladies who will be speaking more on this topic. First off, I'll share with you Stacy Caprioli. Stacy is Chief Appraiser here at NAN, who has more than 15 years experience in this industry. She's a certified residential appraiser and a licensed real estate sales agent, really understands all perspectives involved and is a great voice for the appraiser community, as well as understanding the challenges of the AMCs. And we've also got Melissa Malpass, who is a consumer finance and fair lending attorney at Alston Bird. Melissa advises financial institutions on compliance with federal, state consumer financial laws, disclosures, loan originator compensation, Truth in Lending Act, and she has extensive experience counseling institutions on fair lending matters, things like what we're going to talk about today, specific to developing internal policies, procedures, to make sure that the lenders are in compliance, and monitoring and training specific to the federal consumer financial laws and guidelines. So again, another really valuable perspective that Melissa brings to the table. So I believe that these two ladies are going to be able to share from a wide array of experience, and having the folks on the call, the appraisers on this call, many of whom I'm sure have been in this business for some time. Again, your voice matters too. So please don't hesitate to put questions or thoughts into the chat, and I will do my best to get them out to our guests here as quickly as possible. So what are we here to talk about? Well, from a broad basis, we want to talk about where appraisal process came from, the importance of having public trust, expressing that the issues are more than just bias, but also that we need to address bias, and how we restore some of the trust that has eroded over the past couple of years. So let's talk about, from the start, why are we here today? And I'm sure there's a lot of different opinions on why we're here today, right? But let me share from NAN's perspective. As we all know, the topic of equitable treatment and bias, they're in the news, right? All the way from your local papers up to the President of the United States. There's concern about fairness in valuations. And as an AMC, we're in a pretty unique position because we've got direct lines of communication with both the lender community and the appraiser community. And that puts us in the sometimes unenviable role of trying to be respectful and accommodating both to the lenders, the AMCs, the regulators, all of whom don't always see eye to eye. But it's our belief that by engaging in respectful dialogue and by listening carefully to all perspectives, we hope we can bring all the involved parties together to address this really sensitive and important topic. But first, I want to be very clear with an extremely important premise before today's call. And that is that appraisal bias does not necessarily equate to appraiser bias, right? Both do exist, but genuine intentional appraiser bias in our 19 years experience is exceedingly rare, right? Intentionally trying to be biased within a report, that is not what the core issue that we are seeing as the problem. We believe that the vast majority of appraisers are good people, and no good person wants to be accused of bias. So we also understand why appraisers can be passionate about this subject. So at NAN, we're really trying to continue to shift the conversation away from being solely about bias and instead to cover a wider array of opportunities that ensure equitable treatment for all consumers. So with that, let's move forward here. And I wanted to offer just an analogy to really be clear about what I mean when I say appraiser bias is not the same as appraisal bias. And if you guys could just mute your lines, I really appreciate it. Thank you. And here's my analogy, right? So lead paint. Literally for 1,500 years, lead paint was the standard. It was considered an excellent product for the home. When it was discovered that lead paint was in fact hazardous, there's no reasonable person who would vilify the painters for having used it. However, imagine that upon learning of the dangers of lead paint, rather than working with the scientists and the manufacturers and the legislators to find a better way to paint, some of those painters instead wanted to just say, no problem here, I don't want to talk about it. Now, and only now, those painters become complicit, right? The ones who had done nothing wrong now become part of the problem.
Is that too loud, Joe?
And we're here today because we believe all of us, including the AMCs, the appraisers, the lenders, the legislators, we've got a choice. We can choose to either help solve the problem of inequity within appraisals, or we can deny that the issue even exists and subsequently become part of that problem. And it's only because we all here fundamentally believe that appraisers are not biased people that we want to engage with the community to work together and help solve the problem. So if intentional bias is not the primary issue, then what is, right? That's the key question. And to answer that question, let's start from the beginning. Stacy, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of the appraisal process?
Thank you, Steve. So great introduction. Welcome, everyone. As Steve had mentioned, please put chat messages, comments in the bubble so that we can continue the discussion as we go through this. But as Steve had mentioned, in order to kind of look at where we're going, we have to look at where we came from. And so we wanted to just cover some of the basis of where the appraisal process has originated. And the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers was founded in 1932, so we are a very long-standing profession. The Society of Real Estate Appraisers was founded in 1935. So again, we have years and years and years of this profession that we have been working through and changes. These organizations were created to help standardize the appraisal process by promoting professional education and upholding high ethical standards. So, and we move into 1991, where the current Appraisal Institute was established when those two organizations unified. So really joining the Institute of Real Estate Appraisers and the Society of Real Estate Appraisers that were the original into the current Appraisal Institute, which we know and all work with currently. The FHA underwriting manual covering the 1930s to the 1950s time period contained principles of dwelling valuation that recognized the distinction between home price and appraised value. And Steve very nicely inserted this picture of a 1960s appraisal report. I think that we can all agree that we don't miss the days of hand sketching all that much, but some of us do still prefer it. But it really does analyze that this profession has been around for a very, very long time. And if we look at the longevity of our profession from 1932 until current and all of the changes in our world and our societies and our cultures, that it really is adapting constantly.
Thank you, Stacy. So that's the backstory on the appraisal process. Let's dig in a little deeper on the public trust factor that we talk about. So because evaluation it only means something if all the involved parties look at it and believe that it's done fairly, done consistently. So tell us about USPAP and how that has helped to establish that public trust.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think all of us on the call, from an appraiser perspective, know that public trust is in the forefront when we got into this profession in our continuing education and all of the documents that we go through. Public trust is really put out there as a primary factor, and it really is the responsibility of the appraiser to maintain. And we see that through multiple areas within USPAP. So the purpose of USPAP is to promote and maintain a high level of public trust in appraisal practice by establishing requirements for appraisers. So that right there is the basis of USPAP. The appraiser's responsibility is to protect the overall public trust. So that's in the preamble. We see it again in the ethics rule, where an appraiser must promote and preserve the public trust. So again, it's growing that thought that we have to promote, maintain, protect, preserve. These are all very strong words that our profession are supporting with this public trust. And then again, we see it in Advisory Opinion 21 that public trust requires that when an individual is expected to perform the ethics and competency of an appraiser, he or she will do so. So we can go through it and see, again, there's a need for public trust, a need to preserve public trust. It really is our responsibility as a profession to make sure that we're upholding and maintaining that the communities that we are serving are trusting us with the valuations that we're providing.
Thank you, Stacy. And Melissa, I want to turn to you to hit on one of the most important slides that we're going to share today. And it happens to be a slide about topics that are not part of today's session. But it's important because, in fairness to the appraiser community, we want to raise awareness about issues beyond bias that can also affect equitable outcomes in the appraisal process. Can you tell us a little bit about those before we dig in on the bias side?
Sure. So if we're looking at equitable outcomes, you know, the media and different focuses right now are on appraiser bias and appraisal bias, as we've talked about. But a lot of that comes from, you know, outside influencers. And there can be a lot of different factors that influence an opinion of value and an appraisal report. And, you know, one of the main things is the role of the GSEs, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and basically their guidelines, and which are designed to ensure that, you know, the value of the collateral supports the loan. And that has always been, you know, the primary goal of the entire valuation process for them, is making sure that the collateral supports the loan. There wasn't really a concern for a long time on things like undervaluation. It's always been sort of the focus on the dangers of overvaluation, and how if there is overvaluation, that collateral might not be adequately supporting the loan and might not be protecting the GSE and the government agency interests. Another big factor is, you know, the effects of historic redlining, as we talked, I think, in our last session about how even the government did play a role in that, you know, decades ago, and how, you know, the effects of redlining have sort of been propagated in terms of, you know, equity and wealth among underserved and minority communities. So that's another factor that continues to affect the possibility of equitable outcomes, you know, beyond anything that the appraiser themselves, you know, himself or herself is doing. And as an example of that, you know, protecting government agency and GSE interests, there was a requirement that HUD had up to 2016, and I think we've mentioned this before, the requirement for an appraiser to address the positive or negative value of gentrification and how that makes a neighborhood more or less desirable, which is no longer permitted. And, you know, various guidance recently from the GSEs and the government agencies, you really can't use a word like gentrification anymore. But all of these things show that this has been, you know, a long time coming, and there are many different factors that influence equitable outcomes beyond what the appraiser, him or herself, is doing. So in future sessions, we're going to try to address these as well, and see what we can do about those and how best to implement, best practices and kind of jive, government agency and GSE guidelines and goals with what we need to do going forward.
Thank you, Melissa. And we definitely will be digging in deeper on those issues in future sessions because each one of them really is important to understand and to address. But today, though, with the focus being on bias, I think when most people hear the word bias, they think of intentionality, purposely trying to harm or discriminate someone. But there's more to defining bias, right? Now, Melissa, can you tell us a little bit more about different types of bias and how they can affect appraisals?
Sure. And as we see here at the top of the slide, bias occurs when favorable or unfavorable attitudes or beliefs about a group inform how we perceive, interact, and behave toward that group. And so that could be positive or negative bias, as you can see from, favorable or unfavorable attitudes. This may be somewhat controversial to say, but there is a general understanding that bias occurs in everyone, but in varying forms and to varying degrees. Some of that bias may be conscious, our own attitudes of which we are aware, and that we act on with respect to a particular group. It's sort of like we understand or accept a particular stereotype. We are conscious of it and we act on it when determining how we're going to approach or what we believe about a particular group. Unconscious bias are attitudes that sort of are beyond our awareness and control. We may not even know that we have them. And that's something a little bit trickier, and those things can manifest themselves just sort of in our conduct or in our actions, and we kind of have to wonder, why do we act that way? And it really takes a lot of, digging to figure out, oh, that I may have had unconscious bias there. And then confirmation bias is the tendency to favor information that aligns with our own existing beliefs or attitudes or stereotypes. So again, we don't have intent there, but it's sort of like we're in our echo chamber or our bubble, and we find information that sort of supports what we already think about a particular group or person.
Thanks, Melissa. I think it's important that we cover that because, again, the mind always, when you hear the word bias, goes to intentionality, and there's so much more out there. And, conscious bias, that's just bad actors. We know they're few and far between, but as an industry, we can have just absolutely zero tolerance for those. That's an easy one, right? But let's hone in on the unconscious bias, the confirmation bias, the more challenging ones to identify and to address. And being honest, again, bias is part of the human condition, right? And no profession is immune from it, even though we wish that they were. So what do? Well, we can educate ourselves about these potential biases and how we can overcome them or avoid them by equipping appraisers with tools to recognize and interrupt those unconscious biases and make sure that we really understand the roots of the inequities that are at the heart of the concern here. So, over the last few years, Appraisal Institute has been working hard to amplify and accelerate all sorts of initiatives, partnerships to bring positive change, to improve diversity within the profession through the Appraiser Diversity Initiative, collaborating with Fannie Mae, with Freddie Mac, the National Urban League. There is a conscious effort to help this issue. But when we talk about eliminating bias in any profession, one of the most effective ways to do that is to ensure representation, right? Representation across racial, ethnic, cultural lines. And when it comes to appraisals, and this is probably not a surprise to most of the folks on this call, but I tell you, it was a little striking to see it in writing. There's a real disparity in racial representation. When we look at the percentage of the population compared to the percentage of the appraiser population, we find that white or Caucasian folks are overrepresented by 41% compared to their population in the US, where Hispanic, Latino, and Black African American folks are more than 60% underrepresented compared to their population. And again, that doesn't mean that you can't do a fair assessment of evaluation, but what it does mean is that there are not enough diverse voices within our profession to help make sure that we are all on the same page with identifying those potential inequities. So really striking to see where our profession sits in terms of the percentage of the appraiser population versus the overall US population. So Melissa, getting back to kind of a legal perspective, could you tell us a little more about, what is some of the risk that's incurred by appraisers, lenders, AMCs when it comes to bias? What are we seeing happening more recently?
Sure. So in terms of redlining and appraisal bias and things like that, there have been various settlements between federal regulators like the CFPB and the DOJ against both banks and non-banks under the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And it really used to be something that was limited to banks, and we're seeing more and more focus on other financial institutions, non-depository, and these, have resulted in very large civil money penalty settlements, as well as affirmative obligations that lenders need to carry out in terms of, lending subsidies, increasing their brick and mortar footprints, just a lot more monetary investment than simply the penalties involved. There have been as well several private lawsuits filed in federal court against lenders and appraisers, alleging undervaluation of properties based on race or ethnicity, again in violation of the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Opportunity Act. And in these actions, both the CFPB and the DOJ have filed their own statements of interest, sort of winging it in terms of what they believe the legal theories of discrimination here should be, rather than, coming up with using the administrative process to come up with rulemaking after, notice and comment. These statements of interest sort of really let us know where these agencies are coming from in terms of who they think, did wrong and what needs to be done to resolve alleged appraiser bias. And these statements of interest kind of, single out not only the lenders, but also the AMCs and appraisers. And they seek to hold the lenders liable for the acts of appraisers, even though they're not employees, or under the control of lenders. And of course, we know that appraisers are not under the control of lenders. That's what appraiser independence is all about. But they're definitely trying to create their own standard of liability here to hold not only appraisers and AMCs liable, but also lenders liable for the acts of the appraisers.
Thanks, Melissa. It's really good information, because again, especially for well-intentioned people, no one wants to find themselves on the wrong end of the CFPB or of lawsuits. So important to take note. And before I jump to the next slide, Rachel asked a great question. And Stacy, I'd love to throw this one to you here. We talked about lack of diversity within the profession. So very fair question. What steps can we take to increase diversity within the profession? Do you have thoughts on that? What we can do as part of this profession, be it appraisers, AMCs, to help encourage diversity and representation?
That's a great question. First of all, one of the things that I think affects us the most in this profession is that as many of our appraisers are retiring, they are not utilizing their kind of end years in the profession to train new hires. And a lot of supervisors have kind of stepped back from doing so, which has created a shortage in the ability to be able to present that education and that boots on the ground style training of measuring the home and photographing. And so in communities where we are looking to diversify, there are often not enough supervisors available. So I would encourage that if you have the capacity to take on a trainee, to do so in any capacity. It's really what is going to keep our industry moving forward. If we start facilitating and growing and making sure that we're educating and taking on that ability to pass on our knowledge base, that would be a first and foremost. And I also think that, the Appraiser Diversity Initiative is really a wonderful thing that's happening in our industry right now. Those forums come into communities and they advertise and they allow question and answer sessions to be able to come forward, to really diversify and expand on what this profession is. And that's really what it comes down to, is there isn't a lot of advertisement about being an appraiser. We're not looking out and saying, hey, let's advertise to these college campuses and really make it a growing profession. And that's what's really becoming a new thing, is that campuses are starting to come in and approve criteria for a real estate degree. And we need to be, as appraisers, a voice in sharing that there are opportunities here for a long-term career. And we need to just be really the ones that push kind of the initiative for diversifying, for growing, and representing that the appraisal profession is strong and there's a lot of longevity in it for somebody who wants to start out.
Thanks, Stacy. I think that's great perspective. And again, Rachel, fantastic question. Thank you for posing it. Jumping back here, I know, Melissa, we talked about the legal side of things, but it's also important that we dive into the public trust element, right? And again, to our appraiser partners on the line, let's be clear. This doesn't mean that you have done something wrong or haven't done something wrong. It means that there's a growing perception that the appraisal process might not be equitable for everyone. So, Melissa, can you give us some examples that demonstrate these concerns? Oh, Melissa, we got you on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. So
Thanks.
yes, so as you all may be aware, there has been a lot in the media about appraisal bias. All of the news networks and PR, they've all come out with their different segments on this subject. And part of that is because there's been a huge increase in complaints filed with the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which, individual complainants can do, or civil rights advocacy groups can also file complaints. And they bring these under the Fair Housing Act if there is any reason to believe in the complainant's mind that there has been some consideration of race, ethnicity, or other protected characteristic in the performance or completion of the appraisal process. The HUD has its own Fair Housing Initiative program and its Private Enforcement Initiative program, which is a subset of that assists these complainants with bringing complaints forward and even places people undercover to find Fair Housing Act violations. And there's been a huge increase in these complaints, and the tenfold number, metric is probably a year and a half old now. HUD has not said what the new, if there's been more of an increase, but we all know sort of in the industry that there has. We just don't know what that increase actually looks like. But as somebody who, helps lenders and appraisers and AMCs represent, defend themselves against these complaints, there have been there have been a lot of them. And so the media has captured on these, particularly because complainants are free to come forward and speak to the media about what they've gone through. And all it really takes, and this is not to discount any true instance of discrimination or bias, but really to bring a complaint before HUD, really all it takes is an allegation that your appraisal was lower than you anticipated. And this happens, primarily or more often in refinance cases, but it can also happen in purchase transactions, that your appraised value came in lower than what you anticipated and that you're a member of a protected class. And so at that point, the burden is on the lender and the AMC and the appraiser to defend their processes and explain why they were legitimate and they did not consider race, ethnicity, or other characteristic. And so, unfortunately, all it takes is a complaint. And at that point, lenders, AMCs, and appraisers, are named in the media and in these lawsuits. So that has contributed, I would say, significantly to this erosion of public trust that we're focusing on today.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And, I think with the bar being set so low to file complaints, it's that much more important that we as an industry can point to all the things that we are proactively doing to ensure that there isn't bias in the process. So really makes a difference. And again, appraisals, you don't often read about appraisals as a featured story in the New York Times, right? We don't want to see these kinds of stories being the representation of our business. We want to talk about what are we doing to evolve? What are we doing to ensure fairness, ensure equitable treatment under the guidelines that we have in place? So really valuable stuff. Thank you for sharing. And, to that point about public trust, I wanted to share some statistics from a survey. It was conducted by Lending Tree, released last year. Some of these may be a little hard to swallow, right? Because these numbers are pretty strong. When you see, and this was thousands of people that Lending Tree surveyed who had an appraisal done recently. And when they asked, do you believe that race was factored into your appraisal valuation? 14% of white respondents said yes. 58% of Black respondents said yes. More than half of Black Americans who had an appraisal done believed that race was a factor in their valuation. And again, that doesn't make it true. This is not an accusation to the appraisers, but I think it's important when we talk about erosion of public trust, that's the perception, right? Asked, have you tried to conceal your race from an appraiser? A quarter of all Black Americans who responded tried to conceal their race. Do you think appraisal discrimination laws need to be strengthened? Overwhelmingly, and this is really across all racial lines, almost half of all respondents said, yes, we need to strengthen appraisal discrimination laws. So what we need to make sure we don't do is that we don't live in our bubble, right? Where we feel like, hey, we're good people. This isn't true. I'm not gonna talk about it, or I'm angry that you're even bringing it up. That will not serve us well. It will not serve any of us well. We need to be upfront, proactive, and addressing these concerns, because whether the underlying facts are or are not real, the concerns are real. The erosion of trust is real. And I think that there is really no debate about that piece. So, Stacy, I want to bring it back to you, though, because, again, we try to take a balanced approach. We have such appreciation for our appraiser partners and the work that they do. Tell us a little bit, we talk about public perceptions, that's important, but I think folks on this call would agree, appraiser community is sometimes shortchanged when it comes to having a real opportunity to share their perspectives on the topic. So as a longtime appraiser yourself, can you share some counterpoints, things that maybe appraisers often wish that lenders and regulators and media would be amplifying more than they are right now?
Yeah, that's a great conversation. And I just want to call out the comment that came into the chat also. And that's very true, that because there is a lot of noise in the industry regarding this, it doesn't mean that there is a substantial overall erosion of public trust. But what it does mean is that we are responsible for maintaining the public trust because there is more noise. So we're not saying that we have to make up for all these errors that other people are doing, but at the same time, if we continue to go out, uphold our public trust, do our jobs as we've been trained to do, we should be able to maintain that public trust. And that's what we're really focusing on doing. And to go into the appraiser perspective, I think that we see a lot of that, and we have a lot of opinions that are, going into what we think when we're, in the media, or we're seeing these conversations being had. And legislators, regulators, lenders, the media often do not consider the factors that can be misinterpreted as bias. And that's where the key conversations that I'm having are from the appraiser perspective. So, for example, incorrect attribution of lower than expected home values bias. So not liking the valuation doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong, that it was the wrong valuation, and it doesn't always indicate bias. So that's where we start to get into this gray area when there's a valuation question, but also a bias question attached to it. So we can see how the appraisers are saying, just because you don't like the opinion does not mean that I had bias against you. Another conversation that we're seeing is that appraisals are an opinion or value. So there is always going to be some subjectivity to the reports that could have nothing to do with bias. We see numerous instances of widely varying valuations where one appraiser does one thing and one appraiser does another thing on the same property, and the bias is not a factor. It really isn't. You can clearly see it's just a selection of comparables. It is differing factors that go into those two differing opinions. So being able to establish that and defend that in the report is really key here for appraisers. And again, honest mistakes happen. So appraisers are not immune to them. None of us are immune to them. So there are some poorly done appraisals that can exist independent of bias. It just happens. So, we have to also point that out, that just because an appraisal is done possibly poorly does not mean there was bias behind it. So we have to point out the key factors that are going into some of these conversations that are kind of skewing or, affecting any of the public trust out there. And again, a lot of what we hear as feedback, especially, we send out these meetings and we have a lot of feedback from our appraiser panel. There's a lot of unfair scrutiny right now where many appraisers feel like they're being broadly vilified in the press. So some of these instances come out in the media and appraisers are saying, well, it's not me. And we kind of all go on the defense. And I would suggest that we flip that. And instead of going on the defense, we start really just pointing out our professionalism, and we start pointing out the positivity to our reports and our longstanding work histories. And instead of really trying to defend ourselves, we start reaching out and having the conversations to be able to improve that public trust. Again, questions from our appraiser panel on whether the issue's been politicized. There's been a lot more involvement in the political aspect of it. And so we have to know, as appraisers, we're not really privy to the conversations until they really come out on a broader level. And so opening up that communication for our appraiser panel is so very important so that all of us know where we stand. We need to know if it's being a politicized item. And again, appraisers have historically been provided with regulations and guidelines that now conflict with bias concerns. So kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation here, we started out visiting the beginning of appraisal and how it has adapted since 1932. The world is changing. And so as we are changing with it, the regulations and the guidelines are going to change. So it's really, again, we have to come from a place that isn't defensive. We have to just start adapting and having conversations to make sure that it's, we are moving with the time and we are moving with the way that all of these regulations need to move.
Thank you, Stacy. I mean, this is really great stuff. And I think it's so important because if we're asking for buy-in from the appraiser community to join us in our efforts to stamp out bias, I think it's important that we acknowledge the good sides, the things that are truly not biased, that are not brought up in the media, that don't get enough attention. So these are all really excellent points. And part of our job here is to amplify the appraisers' voices and make sure that they are heard. So with these great points, are there some tips that you would offer to appraisers who are, they're good, decent people, they have great intentions to treat everyone equally, but they're worried about reports being interpreted as biased?
Yeah, that's a great question, Steve. So appraisers, in my opinion, and where we have a stance on is that appraisers must carry out their obligations in a non-discriminatory manner in accordance with federal and state fair housing laws, and must carefully avoid both conscious and unconscious bias. So, in particular, selection of comparables and degree of adjustment should be reasonable and, where necessary, supported by factual information in the commentary. So you'll kind of hear me, and anyone that, calls me up and is struggling with a report or struggling with something that's going on, it always comes back to the facts, and really maintaining that anything you're placing in that report must be factual. So if it's, really skewed by your opinion, that's where you start to get into that area of needing to know if it's going to be flagged or maybe a revision request. So really just keep in mind that everything must be factual that you're supplying in that report. So factual statements and information only, reporting distances to external obsolescence, reporting distances to, nearby cities, things that can be, a positive factor, state it by the name of the specific structure, things like that. So they are factual items. You are not just including your opinion there. And then appraisers should take reconsiderations of value requests extremely seriously, reviewing it with an open mind and a willingness to revisit items of concern. This one can be very challenging. You know, we all have had these instances where we get an ROV and we say to ourselves, well, you know, I don't feel like I should have to revisit this. But part of that is that all of your work should be repeatable and defendable. So anything that you're putting in that original report, if you have any further clarification that needs to go in order to strengthen that ROV consideration, supply it. So I would say just keep that in mind. The appraisal report should adequately address all proposed comparables and all submitted information. So, you know, whether or not you choose to utilize an ROV comparable supplied by a lender, that's entirely up to you, but provide your reasoning. And, you know, I say this quite a bit, commentary. That's the best we can do, is just really make everything very, very clear for the reader.
Thank you, Stacy. All very helpful tips. Any other pitfalls you'd recommend to watch out for?
Yeah, for sure. I think right now the biggest things that we are seeing are statements of pure opinion. Those are the statements that are going to get flagged, first and foremost. So anything where you would include a statement where it is purely your opinion would most likely have to come back and be reworded into something factual. Again, and I know we discussed this on our last call, appraisers should avoid substantive small talk where there might be some off-topic conversations that could be incorrectly interpreted or expressing bias. So when you're on site, really, come in, be very professional, do, your inspection, explain the steps of your inspection. But I would suggest avoiding small talk. That is often where we start to hear the loudest kind of complaints, is where there might be some small talk behind it. So I would say prevent that. Appraisals should not in any way reference the homeowner. So keep that in mind. Race, ethnicity, protected characteristics, demographic composition of the neighborhood, that is all separate from the value opinion. So it should not reference the homeowner. So keep that in mind when writing out your commentary. And appraisers should steer clear of proxy language or other language that could be interpreted to be based on a protected characteristic. So, I know that many of you have seen the list come out from Freddie and running through, the UCDP, LCA. I would suggest that you review those lists and see which of those words you might use commonly. They may have changed because things are changing. So I would go back and start to look at some of your paragraphs, some of your support for your market areas, and look at some of the wording and make sure that you're not using any of that proxy language in there. Factual conversation entirely.
Really great tips again, Stacy. Thank you for that. And, as we start to wrap up, I want to talk about, as we look to restore public trust, I think from listening today, it's clear all of us have a role to play in that process. If the legislators and the regulators and the media continue to approach this topic as though the problem is primarily centered on appraisers being biased, it's going to undermine the ability to reassure the public that the issue of valuation disparities across lines can be fixed. And it's also going to undermine the ability to bring appraisers into the fold to help in the areas where there are genuinely places to help. Similarly, though, if a significant faction of the appraiser community denies the existence of any problem, that's also going to undermine faith in the profession, and it's going to undermine the idea for the legislators and the regulators to look at the appraisers as being genuinely fair people who are looking to help make things better. Instead, where we leave things is if we as an industry can work together, if we can listen to the different perspectives, if we can have an open mind for evolving and improving the profession, we believe we can accomplish reduction of liability concerns for the lenders, we can increase the public trust for the appraiser community, and I think what we would all agree, most importantly, we can ensure equitable treatment in the home valuation process for all Americans. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions. Like I said, feel free to type away here. Our goal today was to present a fair and even-handed look at the topics. We hope that you felt that was the case. We know, again, this is a very sensitive subject for a variety of reasons, and we do appreciate the professionalism of the appraiser community as a whole and really value your input and ideas for how we can continue to evolve and make this industry stronger. So please, if you have anything to share, questions, comments, or otherwise, there is a chat button at the top left of your screen. You click that, it's going to open up a window on the right, and you can type your message and hit enter. So I'm going to go ahead and pause for just a minute if anybody would like to submit any questions or comments. And by all means, even if not right now, you see here that website as well as that email address, appraisertraining@nan-amc.com. We want to hear from you. We want to engage. I tell you, one of the great frustrations from an AMC perspective, and I get it, I understand why, right? But appraisers often will congregate on appraisal message boards. And those appraiser message boards are only open to appraisers. So what do you get there? You wind up in an echo chamber. You wind up not being able to have your voice heard by outside participants and also not hearing perspectives from others. We would love to sit in on some of these conversations, to be invited to participate, even if it's just to listen and learn your perspective. So please do think about ideas for ways that appraisers might be able to open up more access for others in the industry to be involved, to have that dialogue. Because when we talk to one another, when we listen to one another, that's when we really start to solve problems. Well, I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in, so it looks like, ladies, you really hit on it all here. Stacy, Melissa, thank you so much for your expertise and for sharing this information. Attendees, really appreciate having you here. It looks like we do have a couple of comments coming in. Let's see. As an appraiser, I've tried to conceal my race to receive orders. That's a different perspective too. My race has been brought up by homeowners because I'm a Black American certified residential appraiser for over 10 years. This is a real issue. Alexandra, 100% right. These racial concerns and disparities when it comes to diversity, they do cut both ways. And it's important that our appraisers' voices are heard here too. And we appreciate your perspective because having lived it, I think you probably can that much more understand the other side of the coin, people who are concerned about equity in appraisals.
Yeah,
and
that's a great,
Steve,
and just to expand on that, I think that that's exactly what we kind of we're talking about from the appraiser perspective, is that we don't hear enough of that side of the coin. So we need to have these open conversations. And as Steve had mentioned, we have a lot of appraisal board, forums that are out there, and there's Facebook, and there's all of these different chats happening. But again, we at the AMC can't help if we don't know. So we open that up for this dialogue so that you can share these sides of the story so that we can come from an equitable solution. We need to make sure that we're not just listening to the lenders and the homeowners, but we also need the appraisers to really voice what is truly happening in the industry that you live in every single day.
Yeah, excellent perspective. Thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Alexandra, for sharing that. And I tell you, we had a comment here that hits home for me, talking about being cautious about using the phrase equitable outcomes in appraisals. Let me tell you, this is where dialogue comes in so handy, right? When we sent out the invitation, that was the title of the webinar, Ensuring Equitable Outcomes and Rebuilding Public Trust. I got great feedback from several appraisers who pointed out that equitable outcomes shouldn't be the goal. It should be equitable treatment. And if you go back to the first slide here, if you rewatch this, which I hope you all do, you will see that we renamed this webinar in order to make that change, because we listened, we heard from the appraisers, and we agreed. So yes, equitable outcomes can be misinterpreted in a way that we don't want it to be. And that's why we have since retitled this Ensuring Equitable Treatment and Rebuilding Public Trust. So thank you for that feedback, and thank you to the appraisers who shared that feedback via email in advance too. And thank you, Jerry. Appreciate the nice comment there. Guys, again, really excellent dialogue. We appreciate all of you and your contribution to the profession and your contribution to helping evolve it and make it that much stronger. As an AMC, we wouldn't be here without you, and we value those relationships with the appraiser community and intend to continue working closely with you, as well as with the lending community, the legal community, in order to make sure that we help solve any challenges that come our way. So thank you again. This is the second of 4 sessions that we plan to hold this year, and cover a variety of topics related in general to equitable treatment and the concerns thereof. So I hope you'll join us again next time. We'll be sure to let you know when that next one comes out. And in the meantime, we appreciate all of you. Hope you have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.